What if the emotions you think are protecting you are actually the reason you feel stuck in life? In this audiobook summary of Emotional Agility by Susan David, you are about to discover how most people get trapped by their own thoughts, fears, and feelings without even realizing it. This powerful book reveals why fighting or avoiding your emotions only makes life harder, and instead teaches you how to face them with clarity, strength, and control. If you often feel overwhelmed, overthink situations, or struggle to move forward in life, this is exactly the kind of mindset shift you need. By listening to this full audiobook summary, you will learn how to break free from negative thought patterns, understand your emotions without being controlled by them, and start making decisions based on your true values rather than temporary feelings. Stay until the end because this video will completely change the way you see your emotions and help you build a stronger, calmer, and more focused version of yourself. The core idea behind the problem with avoiding emotions in Emotional Agility by Susan David is that most people do not struggle because they feel too much, but because they try too hard not to feel at all. In daily life, we are constantly taught, directly or indirectly, to push away uncomfortable emotions like sadness, anger, fear, jealousy, or disappointment. At first, this seems helpful. For example, someone might go through a breakup and immediately tell themselves to stay strong and not think about it. Or a student who fails an exam might distract themselves with social media instead of processing the frustration. But the book explains that avoiding emotions does not erase them. It simply buries them deeper, where they quietly influence behavior, decisions, and mindset without our awareness. Think about a working professional who receives criticism from their manager. Instead of acknowledging the feeling of embarrassment or insecurity, they might suppress it and act like it doesn't matter. On the surface, they continue working normally, but internally, that unprocessed emotion can turn into defensiveness, low confidence, or even resentment toward the job. Over time, this emotional avoidance builds pressure, like ignoring a warning light in a car. It doesn't fix a problem, it only delays a breakdown. Another example is someone who constantly avoids fear by refusing to take risks. They may tell themselves they are being practical, but in reality, the fear is silently controlling their choices, limiting growth, opportunities, and personal success. Susan David emphasizes that emotions are not enemies, they are signals. Fear might be pointing towards something important that requires preparation. Sadness might be signaling a loss that needs acceptance. Anger might be showing that a boundary has been crossed. When we avoid these signals, we lose valuable information about our inner world. Instead of making clear decisions, we start reacting unconsciously, often in ways that later confuse us. For instance, someone who ignores chronic stress may suddenly burn out without understanding why it happened, even though the warning signs were present for a long time. A powerful real-life application of this idea is learning to pause instead of suppress. When you feel a strong emotion, instead of immediately distracting yourself or labeling it as bad, try asking, what am I actually feeling right now? What triggered this emotion? What is this emotion trying to tell me? Even this small shift creates emotional awareness, which is a first step toward emotional agility. Another practical approach is to name the emotion clearly. Research in psychology suggests that simply labeling emotions like I am feeling anxious or I am feeling rejected reduces their intensity and gives your brain more control over them. The book also challenges a common belief that strong people do not feel deeply. In reality, emotional strength comes from facing emotions, not avoiding them. A person who acknowledges their fear before a big presentation, instead of pretending it does not exist, is often more prepared and confident than someone who suppresses it completely. Avoidance may create short-term comfort, but it leads to long-term confusion and emotional instability. Acceptance, on the other hand, creates clarity and control. This section ultimately teaches that avoiding emotions does not make life easier. It makes life less honest. When emotions are ignored, they do not disappear. They resurface in unexpected ways such as stress, overthinking, irritability, or even physical exhaustion. The goal is not to eliminate emotions, but to understand and work with them so they do not silently drive your decisions. Main points. Avoiding emotions does not remove them. It only pushes them deeper where they still influence behavior. Unconsciously suppressed emotions often reappear as stress, overthinking, anger, or burnout. Emotions are signals that provide useful information about needs, boundaries, and values. Real emotional strength comes from acknowledging emotions, not denying them practical action. Pause when emotions arise. Identify what you are feeling, and ask what the emotion is trying to communicate. Labeling emotions reduces their intensity and increases clarity. Reflective questions. What emotion am I avoiding right now? How is this avoidance affecting my decisions? What might this emotion be trying to tell me about my current situation? Why emotional agility matters. In Emotional Agility by Susan David explains a powerful truth that most people never consciously realize. It is not the presence of difficult emotions that causes suffering, but the way we respond to them. Life is full of emotional experiences. Stress at work, disappointment in relationships, fear about the future, or frustration with ourselves. But what separates emotionally agile people from emotionally stuck people is the ability to handle these emotions without being controlled or defined by them. Emotional agility matters because it creates a space between what we feel and what we do, and that space is where real freedom, growth, and better decisions are born. Imagine a student who receives a low score on an important exam. One student immediately labels themselves as a failure and starts avoiding studying altogether, believing the emotion of disappointment defines their identity. Another student also feels disappointed, but instead of attaching their identity to it, they recognize the emotion, understand it, and ask what can be improved. The second student is emotionally agile. The first becomes emotionally stuck. The difference is not intelligence or talent, it is emotional response. In real life, this difference shows up everywhere. In relationships where one partner reacts impulsively out of anger while the other pauses and communicates calmly, or in workplaces where one employee shuts down after criticism while another uses it as feedback for growth. Susan David emphasizes that emotional agility is important because emotions are not just temporary feelings. They directly influence our decisions, habits, and long-term life direction. For example, someone who constantly avoids discomfort may stay in a job they hate for years, not because it is a right choice, but because fear of uncertainty controls them. Another person may repeatedly enter unhealthy relationships because they avoid the discomfort of loneliness. Without emotional agility, people often live reaction-based lives rather than value-based lives. They react to what feels comfortable in the moment instead of choosing what is meaningful in the long run. A key insight from this section is that emotional agility allows you to step back and observe your emotions instead of becoming them. For instance, instead of thinking, "I am anxious, so I cannot do this," an emotionally agile mindset would say, "I am noticing anxiety, but I can still take the next step." This shift might seem small, but it completely changes behavior. A person preparing for a public speech might still feel nervous, but instead of canceling or avoiding it, they acknowledge the nervousness and proceed anyway. Over time, this builds confidence not because the emotion disappears, but because they learn they can function alongside it. This matters deeply in everyday life because most major regrets do not come from feeling emotions, but from letting emotions silently make decisions for us. People often look back and realize they did not take opportunities because they were afraid, not because they were incapable. Emotional agility gives you the ability to feel fear, doubt, or uncertainty without letting those feelings dictate your actions. It helps you align your behavior with your values instead of your temporary emotional state. Another important application of emotional agility is in relationships. Many conflicts arise not because of major issues, but because of unprocessed emotional reactions. A person might feel ignored in a conversation and immediately respond with anger or silence, which escalates a conflict. But someone practicing emotional agility would pause, recognize a feeling of hurt, and express it clearly instead of reacting impulsively. This simple shift can completely change the outcome of relationships, turning conflict into understanding. Ultimately, this section teaches that emotional agility matters because it gives you control over your life direction. Without it, emotions quietly steer your choices, often without you realizing it. With it, you begin to live intentionally, making decisions based on your values rather than emotional impulses. It is not about eliminating emotions, but about building the skill to navigate them wisely so they become guidance instead of obstacles. Main points. Emotional agility is the ability to experience emotions without being controlled by them. It creates space between feeling and action, allowing better decisions. People without emotional agility often live reaction-based lives instead of value-based lives. Emotions influence long-term choices in career, relationships, and personal growth. Practical shift. I am feeling anxious instead of I'm anxious and cannot act. Emotional agility improves relationships by reducing impulsive reactions and increasing communication clarity. Real-life application. Pause before reacting. Name the emotion, and choose actions based on values instead of feelings-reflective questions. Are my emotions driving my decisions or just informing them? Where in my life am I reacting instead of choosing? What would change if I acted based on my values rather than my current emotions? Emotional rigidity explained in Emotional Agility by Susan David describes a mental and emotional state where a person becomes stuck in fixed patterns of thinking, feeling, and reacting instead of adapting to life's changing situations. Emotional rigidity happens when people treat their thoughts and emotions as absolute truths rather than temporary experiences. In this state, individuals often become controlled by their inner dialogue, such as, "I always fail," "I am not good enough," or "this situation will never improve," and they begin to act as if these thoughts define reality. The result is a life that feels trapped, reactive, and limited, where personal growth becomes difficult because flexibility of mind is lost. To understand this better, imagine a person who applies for a job and gets rejected. An emotionally rigid mindset immediately turns this single event into a permanent identity. "I am not capable, so I will never succeed in my career." Because of this belief, they stop applying for better opportunities altogether. Now compare this with another person who also gets rejected but interprets it differently. "This attempt didn't work, but I can improve and try again." The situation is the same, but the emotional response is completely different. Emotional rigidity turns experiences into permanent labels, while emotional agility treats them as temporary feedback. This difference quietly shapes the entire direction of a person's life. In real life, emotional rigidity often shows up in relationships as well. For example, a partner might say something hurtful during an argument, and instead of thinking they are upset in this moment, the other person interprets it as "they never respect me." This rigid interpretation creates long-term resentment, even if the original situation was temporary and emotional. Similarly, in workplaces, an employee who receives criticism might immediately think, "My boss is always against me," instead of seeing it as constructive feedback. This leads to defensiveness, reduced performance, and emotional distance from growth opportunities. Susan David explains that emotional rigidity is not just about negative thinking. It is about being fused with your thoughts and emotions so deeply that you cannot see alternatives. When people are emotionally rigid, they lose psychological flexibility. For example, a student who believes, "I am bad at math," will avoid practicing, avoid asking questions, and avoid challenges. Over time, this belief becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The emotion of frustration turns into avoidance, and avoidance leads to poor performance, which then reinforces the original belief. This cycle keeps repeating, locking the person in the same mental pattern. Another important aspect of emotional rigidity is how it causes people to over-identify with temporary emotional states. A person might feel anxious before a presentation and conclude, "I'm an anxious person," instead of recognizing, "I'm experiencing anxiety right now." This subtle difference in language creates a massive difference in mindset. One creates identity-based limitation, while the other creates temporary awareness. Emotional rigidity turns passing emotional states into permanent identities, which limits confidence, growth, and decision-making. A practical example of emotional rigidity in daily life can be seen in procrastination. Someone might avoid starting a project because they feel overwhelmed. Instead of addressing the feeling, they create a rigid belief like, "I always work better under pressure," or "I cannot start unless I feel motivated." This leads to delay, stress, and last-minute pressure. Over time, the pattern strengthens, and the person starts believing that procrastination is simply who they are, instead of recognizing it as a changeable emotional response pattern. Breaking emotional rigidity begins with awareness. One of the most powerful shifts is learning to separate yourself from your thoughts. Instead of saying, "I am a failure," you begin to say, "I am having the thought that I am a failure." This creates distance between you and the thought, reducing its power. Another practical step is questioning fixed beliefs. When you catch yourself thinking in absolutes like "always," "never," or "I cannot," pause and ask, "Is this always true? Is there another way to see the situation?" This helps weaken rigid thinking patterns and open space for flexibility. Emotional rigidity matters because it silently limits potential. Many people do not fail because they lack ability, but because they interpret setbacks through a rigid emotional lens that discourages further action. When you become emotionally rigid, you stop adapting. When you become emotionally agile, you start learning. Life becomes less about avoiding discomfort and more about growing through it. Main points. Emotional rigidity is when people treat thoughts and emotions as fixed truths instead of temporary experiences. It causes people to become stuck in limiting beliefs like, I always fail or I am not capable. It turns temporary events into permanent identities, blocking growth and confidence. Real-life impact appears in careers, relationships, and self-perception. Practical example. Rejection or criticism is interpreted as identity failure instead of feedback. Emotional rigidity fuels procrastination, avoidance, and fear-based decision-making. Key shift. I am a failure. I am having the thought that I am a failure. Practical action. Challenge absolute thinking. Words like always, never, and cannot. Reflective questions. Am I treating my thoughts as facts? Where in my life am I stuck in fixed thinking? How would my actions change if I saw the situation as temporary instead of permanent? Why we get stuck in thoughts and emotional agility by Susan David explains a subtle but powerful psychological trap. The human mind is designed to think, analyze, and predict, but sometimes it becomes so absorbed in its own thinking that we start believing every thought is a fact. Instead of observing thoughts as temporary mental events, we begin to live inside them, replay them, and build our identity around them. This is how people get mentally stuck, not because thoughts exist, but because they stop questioning them. A thought like I am not good enough or I will fail if I try does not stay as a passing idea. It grows, repeats, and slowly becomes a belief that shapes behavior, emotions, and decisions. Imagine a person preparing for an interview. One day, they think, what if I mess up? At first, it is just a small passing worry. But instead of letting it go, they start replaying it repeatedly in their mind. They begin imagining worst-case scenarios, visualizing embarrassment, and recalling past mistakes. Soon, that single thought turns into a mental loop that feels real and urgent. Because of this loop, they become anxious, lose confidence, and may even avoid the interview altogether. The thought itself did not harm them directly. It was a mental attachment and repetition that created fear and paralysis. This is how people get stuck, not in reality, but in their interpretation of reality. In daily life, this pattern appears in many forms. For example, a student who receives one low grade might repeatedly think, I'm bad at this subject. Instead of treating it as feedback, they replay the thought every time they sit down to study. Eventually, their brains start associating the subject with failure, which reduces motivation and increases avoidance. Similarly, in relationships, a small misunderstanding can lead to repeated thinking like they don't care about me, which grows stronger with repetition until it feels like a permanent truth, even if it was never fully accurate. Thoughts gain power not because they are true, but because they are repeated without challenge. Susan David explains that we get stuck in thoughts because the brain is wired for pattern recognition and survival. It tries to protect us by predicting outcomes based on past experiences, but in doing so, it often exaggerates threats and limitations. When we do not step back and question these thoughts, we become fused with them. Instead of saying, I am noticing a thought that I might fail, we say, I will fail, and this shift turns a possibility into a perceived reality. The mind does not naturally distinguish between thinking and truth unless we train it to do so. A powerful example of this is seen in procrastination. A person thinks this task is too difficult, and instead of testing this belief, they accept it as truth. They delay starting, which increases pressure, and then interpret the pressure as confirmation that the task is indeed difficult. This creates a loop. Thought leads to avoidance. Avoidance leads to stress, and stress reinforces the original thought. Over time, the person becomes stuck not because the task is impossible, but because the thought cycle has taken control of their behavior. Breaking free from being stuck in thought starts with awareness and separation. One practical method is to observe thoughts instead of obeying them. For example, instead of saying, I am going to fail, you can reframe it as, I am having the thought that I might fail. This simple shift creates psychological distance, allowing you to see the thought as mental content rather than reality. Another useful practice is to pause and ask, is this thought a fact or an assumption? What evidence do I actually have? What would I tell a friend who had the same thought? These questions interrupt automatic thinking patterns and bring clarity back into decision-making. This concept is important because most limitations people experience are not caused by external reality, but by internal narratives they repeat to themselves. When thoughts are left unexamined, they quietly shape identity, behavior, and life direction. People stop applying for opportunities, stop speaking up, or stop trying new things not because they cannot, but because their thoughts tell them they cannot. Emotional agility begins when you stop treating every thought as a command and start treating them as information. Main points. People get stuck in thoughts when they treat them as facts instead of mental events. Repetition of negative thoughts turns them into beliefs that shape behavior, and identity thought loops create anxiety, avoidance, and loss of confidence. Real-life examples include interview fear, academic failure beliefs, and relationship misunderstandings. Procrastination is often fueled by unchallenged thoughts that create avoidance cycles. Key shift. I will fail. I am having the thought that I might fail. Practical action. Observe thoughts, question their validity, and separate thinking from reality. Reflective questions. What thoughts am I repeating without questioning? Where am I confusing thoughts with facts? How would my behavior change if I did not believe every thought I have? Negative Thought Patterns in Emotional Agility by Susan David explains how the human mind can fall into repetitive loops of pessimistic thinking that distort reality and quietly shape how we see ourselves, others, and the world. These patterns are not single thoughts, but recurring mental habits such as self-criticism, worst-case thinking, overgeneralization, and constant comparison with others. Instead of experiencing each situation freshly, people begin to interpret new experiences through old mental filters. Over time, this creates a default negativity bias where even neutral or positive events get overshadowed by doubt, fear, or self-judgment. For example, imagine a person who makes a small mistake during a presentation at work. Instead of seeing it as a normal human error, they begin thinking, I always mess things up when it matters. This single thought does not stay isolated. It becomes a pattern. The next time they have to speak in a meeting, they remember that mistake, feel anxious, and perform with less confidence. Afterward, even if they do well, their mind focuses only on what went slightly wrong. This is how negative thought patterns reinforce themselves, not through reality, but through selective attention and repetition. The mind begins collecting evidence only for what it already believes. Another common example appears in everyday social life. A person might send a message to a friend and not receive a reply immediately. Instead of considering simple explanations like the friend being busy, a negative thought pattern might automatically say they are ignoring me or I am not important to them. This thought then triggers emotional discomfort, leading to further overthinking and anxiety. Later, when the friend responds normally, the emotional impact has already been created, even though the initial assumption was incorrect. This shows how negative thought patterns can create emotional reactions based on interpretation rather than reality. Susan David explains that these patterns often form over time due to repeated experiences, upbringing, and emotional conditioning. The brain tries to protect us by predicting danger, failure, or rejection based on past events, but this protective mechanism can become overactive. Instead of helping us prepare for reality, it starts limiting our perception of what is possible. A student who has struggled in one subject may begin thinking, I am not smart enough, and this belief becomes a lens through which they approach all academic challenges. Even before trying, they expect failure, which reduces effort, focus, and motivation, eventually making the belief feel true. One of the most damaging effects of negative thought patterns is that they influence identity. People do not just think, I failed this task. They begin to think, I am a failure. This shift from behavior to identity is what makes these patterns so powerful and difficult to break. Once identity is attached to negative thinking, every new experience is filtered through that identity. Even success may feel like luck or coincidence rather than capability. This creates a cycle where confidence remains low regardless of actual performance. A real-life application of understanding negative thought patterns is learning to interrupt them before they escalate. When you notice a repeated negative thought, instead of accepting it, you can pause and ask, is this thought based on facts or assumptions? Am I seeing the full picture or only the negative parts? What evidence contradicts this belief? For example, if you think, I am bad at communication, you can reflect on times when you successfully express yourself or were understood clearly. This helps break the selective memory bias that fuels negativity. Another practical strategy is reframing the pattern instead of fighting it. If your mind says, I always fail, you can shift it to, I have faced challenges before, but I also have succeeded in many situations. This does not deny reality but expands it. The goal is not to force positive thinking, but to create balanced thinking. Emotional agility is about seeing both strengths and struggles instead of being trapped in only one perspective. These patterns matter because they silently influence decisions every day. A person who believes things never work out for me may stop trying new opportunities, avoid risks, or settle for less than they deserve. On the other hand, someone who learns to recognize and question these patterns can respond more clearly to life instead of reacting from past conditioning. Awareness becomes the first step toward freedom from automatic negativity. Main points. Negative thought patterns are repeated mental habits like self-criticism, fear, and worst-case thinking. These patterns distort reality by filtering new experiences through old beliefs. Real-life examples include workplace mistakes, social misunderstandings, and academic self-doubt. They often turn temporary events into identity-based beliefs like, I am a failure. The brain's protective mechanism can overgeneralize past experiences into present fear. Practical action. Pause and question whether thoughts are facts or assumptions. Reframing helps create balanced thinking instead of forced positivity. Breaking patterns improves decision-making, confidence, and emotional clarity. Reflective questions. What negative thoughts repeat in my mind daily? Am I treating assumptions as facts? How would my life change if I challenged my most common negative belief? Getting hooked by emotions. In Emotional Agility by Susan David describes the experience of being psychologically pulled into emotions so strongly that they begin to control thoughts, behavior, and decision-making. When a person is hooked, they are no longer simply feeling an emotion. They are reacting to it, identifying with it, and allowing it to dictate their actions. This happens when emotions like anger, fear, shame, or anxiety take over the mind, and instead of observing them, a person becomes fused with them. The emotion becomes a lens through which everything is interpreted, often distorting reality and leading to impulsive or unhelpful behavior. Imagine a situation where someone receives critical feedback from their manager. In a hooked emotional state, the person does not just feel disappointed. They may feel attacked, disrespected, or worthless. That emotion then drives their reaction. They might respond defensively, shut down, or even quit impulsively, not because of the feedback itself, but because of how deeply they are hooked by the emotional reaction to it. Later, when the emotion settles, they may realize the feedback was actually constructive, but by then the damage to relationships or opportunities may already be done. The hook is not the emotion itself, but the automatic reaction that follows it without awareness. Another common example appears in relationships. A person might see their partner being quiet or distant and immediately feel rejected. That feeling of rejection becomes so strong that they become hooked by it, leading them to act cold, accusatory, or withdrawn. Instead of asking what is actually happening, they assume the emotion is truth. Later, it may turn out the partner was simply tired or distracted, but the emotional reaction has already created conflict. This is how being hooked by emotions can turn small misunderstandings into major emotional distance. Susan David explains that emotions are not harmful in themselves. The problem begins when we become entangled with them. Being hooked means losing the ability to separate feeling from action. For example, a student who feels anxious before an exam might interpret that anxiety as proof that they are unprepared or incapable. Because of this, they may panic, avoid studying, or perform poorly, not because of lack of knowledge, but because the emotional state dictated their behavior. The emotion becomes a driver instead of the observer, and actions follow the emotional wave rather than conscious choice. In everyday life, being hooked often shows up in subtle ways. A person scrolling through social media might see others achieving success and immediately feel envy or inadequacy. That feeling hooks them into a comparison loop where they continue scrolling, feeling worse, and reinforcing the belief that they are behind in life. Another example is during arguments, where anger hooks people into saying things they do not mean. In that moment, the emotion feels justified and urgent, but afterward, regret often follows when clarity returns. The hook is powerful because it makes emotions feel like instructions rather than temporary experiences. The book emphasizes that emotions are like waves. They rise, peak, and eventually fall. But when people are hooked, they try to either fight the wave or get carried away by it completely. Neither response is helpful. Instead, emotional agility teaches the ability to notice the wave without being dragged by it. For example, instead of thinking, I am angry and must respond immediately, an emotionally agile response would be, I notice I'm feeling anger right now, but I do not need to act on it immediately. This small gap between emotion and action is where better decisions are made. A powerful way to deal with being hooked is to create distance between yourself and the emotion. One practical method is labeling what is happening internally. Instead of saying I am anxious, you can say, I notice that anxiety is present. This shift helps reduce the intensity of the emotion and prevents it from taking over your behavior. Another approach is to pause before reacting and ask, what is this emotion making me want to do right now? Is that action aligned with my values, or is it just a reaction? This reflection interrupts automatic emotional responses. Understanding emotional hooks is important because most regrettable decisions in life are not made in calm states, but in emotionally hijacked moments. People often say things they regret, quit things prematurely, or make impulsive choices not because they lack intelligence, but because they were hooked in that moment. Emotional agility is the skill of recognizing when you are hooked and choosing to step back instead of being pulled forward. Main points. Being hooked means becoming emotionally fused with feelings, so they control thoughts and actions. Emotions like anger, fear, and shame can distort perception and trigger impulsive reactions. Real-life examples include workplace criticism, relationship misunderstandings, and social media comparison. Emotional hooks lead to reactions that are often regretted later when emotions settle. The key problem is not emotions themselves, but automatic, unexamined responses. Practical action. Label emotions and create distance between feeling and action. Pause and ask whether your reaction aligns with your values or is purely emotional. Emotional agility helps prevent emotional hijacking and improves decision-making. Reflective questions. When do I get emotionally hooked most easily? What actions do I take when I'm emotionally overwhelmed? How would my behavior change if I paused before reacting to strong emotions? Accepting emotions instead of avoiding them. In Emotional Agility by Susan David explains a transformative idea. Emotional strength does not come from suppressing, escaping, or fighting difficult emotions, but from allowing them to exist without resistance. Most people grow up believing that uncomfortable emotions such as sadness, fear, anger, or shame are problems that need to be fixed immediately. As a result, they try to push these feelings away through distraction, denial, overworking, or even pretending everything is fine. However, the book reveals that avoidance does not eliminate emotions. It only delays and strengthens them, often making them more disruptive later in life. To understand this, imagine a person going through financial stress. Instead of acknowledging their fear and uncertainty, they distract themselves by constantly scrolling their phone, watching videos, or overworking without reflection. On the surface, it seems like they are coping, but internally, the anxiety remains unresolved. Over time, this suppressed fear can surface as irritability, insomnia, or burnout. Now compare this with someone who faces the same situation but chooses acceptance. They allow themselves to feel the fear without judgment, acknowledge the uncertainty, and calmly think about what steps they can take. The situation does not immediately change, but their relationship with the emotion does, which makes decision-making clearer and more grounded. In real life, acceptance often looks like simple awareness. For example, a student who feels overwhelmed before exams might normally try to escape that feeling by procrastinating or avoiding study altogether. But when they practice acceptance, they say to themselves, I am feeling overwhelmed right now, and that is okay. I can still take one small step. Instead of fighting the emotion, they make space for it. This reduces internal conflict and allows action to happen despite discomfort. Similarly, in relationships, a person might feel jealousy or insecurity when their partner spends time with others. Instead of denying or acting out of that emotion, acceptance allows them to recognize it, understand its source, and communicate more clearly rather than reacting impulsively. Susan David emphasizes that acceptance does not mean approval or surrender. It does not mean you like the emotion or want it to stay forever. It simply means you stop wasting energy fighting its existence. Emotions are natural responses to experiences, and acceptance allows them to rise and fall like waves instead of becoming internal battles. When people resist emotions, they create tension within themselves, but when they accept them, they create space for clarity. For example, a person who feels grief after a loss might try to avoid sadness by staying constantly busy. But in doing so, the grief remains unresolved. Acceptance allows them to experience sadness fully, which ultimately leads to healing rather than emotional stagnation. A powerful insight from this section is that what we resist often persists. The more we try not to feel something, the more power it gains over us. For instance, someone trying to suppress anger may end up expressing it indirectly through passive aggression or sudden outbursts. On the other hand, when anger is acknowledged calmly, I am feeling angry right now because something feels unfair, it becomes easy to respond thoughtfully rather than react impulsively. Acceptance creates emotional space, and that space leads to better choices. In daily life, applying emotional acceptance can start with small moments. When you notice an uncomfortable emotion, instead of immediately distracting yourself or judging yourself for feeling it, pause and name it. You might say, "I notice I'm feeling anxious," or "I'm experiencing disappointment right now." This simple act reduces internal resistance. Then ask yourself, what is this emotion asking me to notice? What response would align with my values instead of my discomfort? Over time, this practice trains the mind to stop treating emotions as threats and start treating them as information. The key shift is moving from control to awareness. You cannot always control what emotions arise, but you can control how you respond to them. Acceptance does not make emotions disappear instantly, but it prevents them from controlling your behavior. It creates a mental environment where emotions can exist without dictating your actions, which leads to greater emotional stability and resilience. Main points. Acceptance means allowing emotions to exist without fighting, suppressing, or avoiding them. Avoiding emotions does not remove them. It often intensifies and prolongs them. Real-life examples include financial stress, academic pressure, and relationship insecurity. Acceptance improves clarity, decision-making, and emotional balance. Emotions are temporary experiences, not problems. To eliminate practical action, pause, name the emotion, and allow it without judgment. Ask what the emotion is signaling and choose actions aligned with values. Acceptance reduces internal conflict and supports healthier emotional responses. Reflective questions. What emotions am I currently avoiding? How do I typically react when I feel uncomfortable feelings? What would change if I allowed myself to fully feel my emotions without resistance? Facing Reality with Courage in Emotional Agility by Susan David explains that true emotional strength begins when a person stops avoiding, denying, or distorting reality and instead chooses to see things as they actually are, even when the truth feels uncomfortable. Many people struggle not because reality is too harsh, but because they delay confronting it. They stay in denial, minimize problems, or create hopeful illusions that everything will fix itself without action. This emotional avoidance creates temporary comfort but long-term instability, because unaddressed reality eventually demands attention in more painful ways. To understand this, imagine a person who is unhappy in their job. Deep down, they know the work does not align with their interests, values, or long-term goals. However, instead of facing this truth, they keep telling themselves it's not that bad or things will improve eventually. Months or even years pass in this cycle of avoidance, and dissatisfaction slowly turns into burnout, frustration, and loss of motivation. Now compare this with someone who faces the same reality early. They acknowledge, I am not fulfilled in this job, and I need to evaluate my options. This honest recognition may feel uncomfortable in the moment, but it opens a door to planning, change, and growth. Courage here is not about making immediate, drastic decisions, but about refusing to ignore what is real. In everyday life, avoiding reality often appears in relationships. For example, a person may notice repeated disrespect or emotional distance in a relationship, but avoid acknowledging it fully because they fear loneliness or change. Instead of addressing the issue, they rationalize it by focusing only on good moments or hoping the situation will magically improve. Over time, this avoidance leads to deeper emotional pain. On the other hand, facing reality with courage means acknowledging what is happening without exaggeration or denial. It might involve having difficult conversations, setting boundaries, or making thoughtful decisions based on truth rather than fear. Susan David emphasizes that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in the presence of fear while staying grounded in reality. A student preparing for an exam might feel overwhelmed and want to avoid studying by distracting themselves. Facing reality means admitting, I am not prepared enough and I need to put in consistent effort, instead of escaping into temporary comfort. Similarly, someone dealing with financial stress may avoid checking their expenses because it feels stressful. However, avoiding the numbers does not reduce the problem. It only delays necessary action. Facing reality allows them to understand the situation clearly and take steps toward improvement. A key insight from this section is that reality does not become easier by ignoring it. It becomes heavier. When people avoid facing truth, they often live in a cycle of anxiety because part of their mind knows what they are avoiding. This creates internal tension between awareness and denial. For example, someone who knows they are overworking but refuses to acknowledge burnout may continue pushing themselves until their body forces rest through illness or exhaustion. Courageous awareness prevents this build-up by addressing issues early, when they are still manageable. Practically, facing reality with courage starts with honest self-reflection. It requires asking uncomfortable but necessary questions such as, what is actually happening in my life right now? Not what I hope is happening. Where am I pretending things are fine when they are not? What decisions am I delaying because I'm afraid of the outcome? When you answer these questions without judgment, you begin to see situations more clearly. This clarity is a foundation for meaningful change because decisions made from truth are stronger than decisions made from denial. Another important application is separating facts from fears. Often, people avoid reality because they mix what is happening with what they fear might happen. For example, losing a job might trigger fears like, I will never find another one or my life is ruined. Facing reality with courage means separating the fact, job loss, from the fear-based assumptions and then responding step by step rather than reacting emotionally. This shift helps reduce panic and increases problem-solving ability. Ultimately, this section teaches that courage is not about ignoring fear or discomfort, but about choosing clarity over avoidance. When people face reality directly, they gain power over their choices instead of being controlled by uncertainty and denial. It allows them to act earlier, make better decisions, and reduce long-term emotional suffering caused by prolonged avoidance. Main points. Facing reality with courage means acknowledging truth even when it is uncomfortable. Avoidance creates temporary relief but leads to long-term emotional and practical problems. Real-life examples include job dissatisfaction, relationship denial, academic pressure, and financial stress. Courage is acting in the presence of fear while staying grounded in facts. Avoiding reality increases anxiety because the mind remains aware of what is being ignored. Practical action. Ask honest questions about current reality and identify areas of denial. Separate fact from fear-based assumptions to reduce emotional distortion. Early awareness leads to better decisions and prevents long-term burnout or regret. Reflective questions. What truth am I avoiding right now? Where am I choosing comfort over clarity? What would change in my life if I fully accepted my current reality? Detaching from thoughts in Emotional Agility by Susan David explains a powerful mental skill, learning to step back from your thoughts instead of being completely absorbed by them. Most people naturally assume that whatever they think is automatically true or important, but this is where many emotional struggles begin. Thoughts constantly appear in the mind, some helpful, some neutral, and many distorted by fear, past experiences, or imagination. When a person is attached to their thoughts, they begin to treat them as commands or facts, which can limit behavior, confidence, and decision-making. Detachment does not mean ignoring thoughts or suppressing them. It means observing them with awareness rather than becoming controlled by them. To understand this, imagine a person preparing for a job interview. A thought suddenly appears, I am going to fail. If they are attached to this thought, they immediately accept it as truth. Their confidence drops, their body language changes, and they may even perform poorly because they have already emotionally accepted failure before it happens. Now imagine another person in the same situation who notices the same thought but responds differently. Instead of believing it, they say to themselves, I am having the thought that I might fail. This small shift creates distance between the person and the thought. The thought is no longer a fact, but a mental event. As a result, they can still feel nervous but continue preparing and performing with clarity. In everyday life, detachment from thoughts plays a crucial role in how people handle stress and self-criticism. For example, a student might think, I am not smart enough to pass this subject. If they are fused with this thought, it becomes a belief that influences behavior. They may stop studying, avoid asking questions, or give up early. But when they learn to detach, they recognize it as just a thought, not a fact. They can then say, I am noticing a thought that I am not smart enough, and continue studying despite the discomfort. This shift allows action to continue even when the mind produces negativity. Another common situation is in relationships. A person may have a thought like they don't care about me when a partner is busy or less responsive. If they are attached to that thought, it can quickly turn into emotional reactions such as anger, insecurity, or withdrawal. However, If they practice detachment, they pause and recognize that this is one interpretation, not absolute truth. They might consider other possibilities, such as their partner being tired or distracted. This prevents unnecessary conflict and allows for clearer communication instead of emotionally driven assumptions. Susan David emphasizes that thoughts are not facts. They are mental experiences shaped by perception, memory, and emotion. The mind is constantly generating interpretations of reality, but not all interpretations are accurate or helpful. When people detach from thoughts, they create space between stimulus and response. In that space lies freedom, the ability to choose actions based on values rather than automatic thinking. For example, someone who feels anxious before speaking in public may still think, "I will embarrass myself." But by detaching, they can acknowledge the thought without letting it dictate behavior. They might say, "I notice my mind is producing anxiety-related thoughts, but I will still speak." A powerful real-life application of detaching from thoughts is learning to pause before reacting. Instead of immediately responding to every thought, you begin to observe patterns. You might notice recurring thoughts like, "I always mess things up," or "nothing works out for me." Instead of arguing with these thoughts or believing them, you practice labeling them as mental events. This reduces their power over time. Another practical method is to imagine thoughts as passing clouds or moving objects in the mind. They appear, stay for a while, and eventually pass. You do not need to grab onto every thought or act on it. Detachment also helps reduce emotional intensity. When people believe every negative thought, emotions like anxiety, shame, and frustration become stronger. But when they step back and observe thoughts as temporary mental activity, emotions lose some of their grip. This creates mental clarity, especially in high-pressure situations such as exams, interviews, conflicts, or important decisions. Instead of reacting impulsively, a person can pause, evaluate, and respond thoughtfully. Ultimately, this section teaches that freedom does not come from stopping thoughts, but from changing your relationship with them. You cannot control every thought that enters your mind, but you can control how much authority you give it. Detaching from thoughts allows you to live more intentionally, making choices based on values and reality rather than mental noise and fear. Main points. Detaching from thoughts means observing them without being controlled by them. Thoughts are not facts. They are mental events influenced by emotion and perception. Real-life examples include job interviews, academic self-doubt, and relationship misunderstandings. Attachment to thoughts leads to emotional reactions and poor decision-making. Key shift. I will fail. I am having the thought that I might fail. Detachment creates space between thought and action, allowing better choices. Practical action. Pause. Label thoughts as thoughts, and avoid treating them as facts. Viewing thoughts as passing mental events reduces their emotional power. Reflective questions. Which thoughts do I treat as absolute truth? How often do my thoughts control my actions? What would change if I observed my thoughts instead of believing every one of them? Observing emotions clearly in Emotional Agility by Susan David explains the essential skill of stepping back and noticing your emotions with honesty and precision instead of being overwhelmed, confused, or controlled by them. Most people experience emotions in a very reactive way. They either suppress them, exaggerate them, or immediately act on them without fully understanding what is happening internally. Observing emotions clearly means developing the ability to recognize what you are feeling, name it accurately, understand its intensity, and see it as information rather than something that defines you or demands instant reaction. This creates a space between feeling and action where clarity and wiser decisions become possible. To understand this, imagine a person who suddenly feels irritated during a conversation at work. If they do not observe the emotion clearly, they may immediately react with anger, interrupt the conversation, or respond in a harsh tone, only to regret it later. But if they pause and observe what is actually happening inside, they might realize that beneath the irritation is a feeling of being disrespected, overlooked. This deeper awareness changes everything. Instead of reacting impulsively, they can respond more thoughtfully, perhaps by calmly expressing their perspective or asking for clarification. The emotion does not disappear, but it becomes understandable and manageable. In everyday life, emotions often appear mixed and confusing. For example, a student receiving low marks might feel bad in a general sense, but that feeling can actually contain multiple layers such as disappointment, fear of failure, embarrassment, and pressure from expectations. If the student does not observe these emotions clearly, they may respond with avoidance, procrastination, or self-criticism without understanding the real cause. However, If they slow down and identify each emotion separately, they can begin to address the root issue. They might realize that the strongest feeling is not failure itself, but fear of disappointing others. This insight allows them to respond with more self-compassion and practical planning instead of emotional collapse. Susan David explains that emotions are not simple experiences. They are complex signals that carry valuable information. When people fail to observe emotions clearly, they often misinterpret them. For example, anxiety might be mistaken for incompetence, anger might be mistaken for aggression, and sadness might be mistaken for weakness. In reality, these emotions are not flaws. They are messages. Anxiety might signal uncertainty or preparation needs. Anger might signal boundaries being crossed, and sadness might signal loss or unmet expectations. When emotions are observed clearly, they become guides rather than obstacles. A real-life scenario where this skill becomes powerful is in relationships. Imagine someone's partner becomes quiet after a disagreement. Without observing emotions clearly, the person might immediately assume rejection or lack of love, leading to defensive behavior or emotional withdrawal. But if they pause and observe their emotional state, they might notice feelings of insecurity, fear of abandonment, and confusion. Recognizing these layers helps them separate assumption from reality. Instead of reacting impulsively, they can choose to communicate openly, asking what is actually going on rather than acting on fear-driven interpretations. Another important example appears in high-pressure situations such as job interviews or public speaking. A person may feel nervous, but that single label hides multiple emotional components such as anticipation, fear of judgment, and excitement. If they only label it as nervousness, they might interpret it negatively and try to suppress it. But when they observe it clearly, they can reframe it as a natural response to importance and preparation. This shift reduces internal resistance and allows them to function more effectively despite the emotion. Susan David emphasizes that observing emotions clearly is not about controlling or eliminating them, but about developing emotional literacy. It is similar to learning a new language. At first, emotions feel vague and overwhelming, but with practice, you begin to recognize subtle differences. You start noticing when frustration is actually exhaustion, or when sadness is actually disappointment mixed with unmet expectations. This clarity transforms emotional chaos into understandable experience, making it easier to respond rather than react. A practical way to apply this in daily life is to pause whenever a strong emotion appears and ask 3 simple questions. What exactly am I feeling right now? Where do I feel this emotion in my body? What might be causing this feeling beneath the surface reaction? For example, instead of simply saying, I am stressed, you might discover, I am feeling overwhelmed because I have too many tasks and I fear not completing them on time. This level of clarity immediately shifts your response from confusion to problem solving. Another useful practice is to separate emotion from interpretation. Instead of saying, this situation is terrible and I feel anxious, you can say, I notice anxiety arising in this situation. This helps you see that emotions are reactions to interpretation, not fixed truths about reality. Over time, this reduces emotional intensity and improves decision-making under pressure. Ultimately, this section teaches that clarity is a foundation of emotional intelligence. When emotions are unclear, they control behavior silently. When emotions are observed clearly, they become useful signals that guide better choices. Emotional agility begins not with eliminating emotions, but with understanding them deeply enough to respond wisely instead of reacting blindly. Main points. Observing emotions clearly means noticing and understanding emotions without being overwhelmed, or reactive emotions often contain multiple layers that need to be identified separately. Real-life examples include workplace irritation, academic stress, relationship misunderstandings, and performance anxiety. Emotions are signals that provide valuable information rather than problems. To eliminate mislabeling emotions leads to confusion and reactive behavior. Practical action. Pause, identify the exact emotion, and explore what lies beneath it. Separate emotion from interpretation to reduce emotional intensity. Emotional clarity improves communication, decision-making, and self-control. Reflective questions. What am I really feeling beneath my surface emotion? Am I reacting to the emotion or understanding it? How would my response change if I fully understood what I'm feeling right now? Discovering Your Core Values in Emotional Agility by Susan David explains one of the most important foundations of a meaningful and emotionally stable life. Understanding what truly matters to you at your deepest level, beyond temporary emotions, social pressure, or external expectations. Many people live their lives reacting to situations, chasing approval, or making decisions based on what feels comfortable in the moment, but later feel empty or directionless because their actions were not aligned with their inner values. Core values act like an internal compass that guides decisions, behavior, and long-term direction, especially when emotions are strong or situations are confusing. To understand this, imagine a person who is offered a high-paying job. On the surface, it looks like a perfect opportunity, and excitement pushes them toward acceptance. But after some time, they begin to feel disconnected, stressed, and unfulfilled because the job does not align with their deeper values, such as creativity, freedom, or meaningful work. Now imagine another person in the same situation who takes a moment to reflect on their core values before deciding. They recognize that while the salary is attractive, what they truly value is growth, balance, and purpose. Because of this clarity, they either negotiate for a role that aligns better or choose a different opportunity altogether. The difference is not intelligence or luck, but awareness of values guiding decisions. In everyday life, many people confuse short-term desires or emotional reactions with long-term values. For example, someone might stay in a relationship because they feel loneliness, even though the relationship no longer reflects respect, trust, or emotional safety. Another person might avoid taking risks because comfort feels safer in the moment, even though their deeper value is growth and self-improvement. Without clarity about core values, people often make decisions that temporarily reduce discomfort, but eventually lead to dissatisfaction and regret. Susan David explains that emotions can be powerful but temporary, while values are stable and enduring. Emotions fluctuate based on circumstances. Fear, excitement, anger, or sadness can appear and disappear quickly, but values remain consistent and act as a guiding reference point. For instance, fear might push someone to avoid public speaking, but if their core value is growth or impact, they can choose to speak despite the fear. Similarly, anger might tempt someone to react harshly in a conflict, but if they value respect in relationships, they may choose a calmer response. Values provide direction when emotions feel confusing or overwhelming. A powerful real-life application of discovering core values can be seen in career decisions. A person might feel stuck in a job because they are influenced by external expectations such as salary, status, or family pressure. However, when they reflect deeply, they may realize that what truly matters to them is autonomy, creativity, or helping others. This awareness allows them to evaluate their current situation more clearly and decide whether to stay, adapt, or move towards something more aligned with their authentic self. Without this clarity, people often drift through life reacting to circumstances instead of intentionally shaping their path. Another example appears in daily habits and routines. Someone might struggle with consistency in fitness or learning new skills because their actions are driven by motivation, which fluctuates. But when they connect those actions to a core value such as health, discipline, or self-respect, they are more likely to stay committed even when motivation is low. Values create consistency because they are not dependent on emotional states. They act as a deeper reason behind behavior, making it easier to persist through discomfort. Susan David emphasizes that discovering core values requires honest reflection rather than external comparison. Many people mistakenly adopt values from society, family, or social media, thinking success, popularity, or wealth are automatically their own priorities. But true emotional agility begins when a person pauses and asks what genuinely matters to them, not what they are being told should matter. This process involves separating external noise from internal truth. For example, someone might realize that while others value achievement and recognition, they personally value peace, learning, or meaningful connection more deeply. A practical way to apply this concept is to regularly ask yourself what truly matters when emotions are removed from the equation. For example, after a conflict or difficult decision, instead of focusing only on what went wrong, you can ask, did my actions align with my values in this situation? If not, what value was missing? Another exercise is to identify your top values and write them down clearly, such as honesty, growth, connection, or independence. When faced with decisions, you can then evaluate options based on alignment with these values rather than emotional pressure alone. Another important insight is that values help reduce confusion in emotionally charged situations. When emotions are strong, they can cloud judgment, but values act as an anchor. For example, during an argument, anger might push someone to say hurtful things, But if they remember their value of respect or kindness, they are more likely to pause and respond thoughtfully. This does not eliminate emotion, but it ensures that behavior is guided by intention rather than impulse. Ultimately, this section teaches that discovering your core values is about understanding who you want to be consistently, not just how you feel in a moment. Values bring stability in a world of emotional fluctuations and external pressures. They help transform emotional agility from a reactive skill into a purposeful way of living, where decisions are guided by meaning rather than momentary feelings. Main points. Core values are internal principles that guide long-term decisions, and behavior emotions are temporary. But values are stable and consistent. Many people make life decisions based on emotions or external pressure instead of values. Real-life examples include career choices, relationships, habits, and conflict situations. Values help align actions with long-term meaning instead of short-term comfort. Practical action. Identify your core values and evaluate decisions based on them. Ask whether your actions reflect your values in difficult or emotional situations. Values act as an anchor during emotional confusion or pressure. Reflective questions. What truly matters to me beyond external expectations? Am I living according to my values or my emotions? Where in my life am I acting against what I believe is important? Living with Purpose in Emotional Agility by Susan David explains that true fulfillment does not come from chasing external achievements alone, but from aligning daily actions with a deeper sense of meaning and direction. Purpose is not a fixed destination or a single grand goal. It is a continuous way of living where choices are guided by what truly matters to you, even in small everyday moments. Many people assume that purpose is something they will find later in life, after success, money, or stability. But the book explains that purpose is actually built through consistent alignment between values, actions, and emotional awareness in the present. To understand this, imagine two people working in the same job. Both may have similar responsibilities and challenges, but their experience of life is very different. The first person views a job only as a way to earn money, so every task feels like pressure, every challenge feels like burden, and every setback feels meaningless. Over time, this creates dissatisfaction and emotional exhaustion. The second person, however, connects their work to a deeper purpose. Even if the job is not perfect, they see it as a way to learn skills, support their family, or contribute value to others. The work becomes more than just routine. It becomes meaningful effort. The external situation is the same, but the internal sense of purpose completely changes the emotional experience. In real life, lack of purpose often shows up as a feeling of emptiness even when things are going well externally. For example, someone might achieve academic success or career growth, but still feel unfulfilled because their actions are not aligned with what they genuinely care about. Another person might feel stuck in a routine life, not because their situation is objectively bad, but because they have no clear sense of why they are doing what they are doing. Without purpose, even success can feel hollow, and challenges can feel overwhelming because there is no deeper reason anchoring the effort. Susan David explains that purpose is deeply connected to values and emotional agility. When people understand their core values and translate them into action, they begin to live with intention instead of reaction. For example, if someone values growth, they will see challenges as opportunities to learn rather than obstacles to avoid. If someone values connection, they will invest more deeply in relationships even during conflicts instead of withdrawing. Purpose is not about eliminating difficulty. It is about giving difficulty meaning. It transforms struggle into direction rather than confusion. A powerful real-life example of living without purpose versus living with purpose can be seen in daily habits. A person who exercises only because they should often struggles with consistency because the motivation is external and fragile. But a person who connects exercise to their deeper purpose of health, strength, or long-term well-being is more likely to stay committed even when motivation drops. Similarly, someone studying only for exams may feel constant pressure, while someone who connects studying to personal growth or future opportunities experiences more resilience and focus. Purpose turns effort into something meaningful rather than something forced. Another important aspect of living with purpose is how it shapes decision-making during uncertainty. Life often presents situations where there is no perfect answer, and emotions can cloud judgment. In such moments, purpose acts as a guiding direction. For example, someone deciding whether to change careers might feel fear of instability, but if their deeper purpose is creativity or helping others, they can evaluate whether the change aligns with that direction. Purpose does not remove fear, but it gives clarity about what matters most when emotions are conflicting. Susan David also emphasizes that purpose is not reserved for extraordinary achievements or rare life events. It exists in ordinary daily actions. A parent comforting a child, a student helping a classmate, or a worker completing a task with care and integrity. All of these can be expressions of purpose when aligned with values. Purpose is not about what you do occasionally. It is about how you do what you already do. This perspective removes pressure and makes purpose accessible in everyday life. A practical way to apply this concept is to regularly ask yourself why you are doing what you are doing. Instead of focusing only on outcomes, reflect on meaning. For example, before starting your day, you can ask, what matters most to me today? How can I bring more alignment between my actions and my values? After completing tasks, you can reflect, did my actions today reflect what I truly care about, or was I just reacting to pressure and routine? These reflections slowly build awareness of whether your life is moving in a direction that feels meaningful or mechanical. Another important practice is to connect small actions to larger intentions. Even simple tasks can become meaningful when linked to purpose. Studying can become about growth. Working can become about contribution. And communication can become about connection. This shift does not change the task itself, but it changes the emotional experience of doing it. Over time, this reduces burnout and increases motivation because actions are no longer disconnected from meaning. Ultimately, this section teaches that living with purpose is not about finding a single life mission, but about consistently aligning your actions with what truly matters to you. It transforms emotional agility from a personal skill into a way of life, where decisions are guided by meaning rather than pressure, and where even challenges become part of a larger, more coherent direction. Main points. Purpose is not a destination, but a way of aligning daily actions with values, and meaning. External success without purpose can still feel empty or unfulfilling. Real-life examples include jobs, studies, habits, and everyday responsibilities. Purpose transforms challenges into meaningful experiences rather than burdens. Emotional agility helps connect emotions, values, and actions into a coherent life direction. Practical action. Regularly ask why you are doing what you are doing and whether it aligns with your values. Small daily actions gain meaning when connected to a larger intention. Purpose improves resilience, motivation, and emotional stability. Reflective questions. What gives my life meaning beyond external success? Am I living by intention or routine? How can I bring more purpose into my everyday actions starting today? Small changes that create big results. In Emotional Agility by Susan David explains that meaningful transformation in life does not come from sudden, dramatic shifts, but from consistent, small, intentional adjustments in how we think, feel, and respond to everyday situations. Many people believe change requires massive effort or complete life overhaul, so they delay action, waiting for the perfect moment to begin. However, the book highlights that emotional and behavioral change is built gradually through repeated micro-decisions that slowly reshape habits, mindset, and identity over time. These small changes may seem insignificant in the moment, but when repeated consistently, they compound into powerful long-term results. To understand this, imagine a person who wants to become more confident in social situations. Instead of forcing a dramatic personality change overnight, they begin with small steps, such as speaking once in a meeting, making brief eye contact during conversations, or expressing one opinion each day. Initially, these actions feel uncomfortable and minor, but over time, they begin to reshape how the person sees themselves. What once felt like fear gradually turns into familiarity and eventually confidence. The transformation does not happen in one moment. It happens through repetition of small actions that slowly rewire emotional responses. In everyday life, this principle appears in many areas. For example, someone struggling with negative thinking does not suddenly become positive by forcing themselves to think differently. Instead, they start by noticing one negative thought per day and gently questioning it. A student who struggles with procrastination does not become disciplined overnight. They begin by studying for just 10 minutes without distraction. A person trying to improve relationships does not transform instantly. They start by practicing small acts of listening, patience, or honest communication. These small actions may seem too simple to matter, but emotionally, they begin to reshape internal patterns of behavior and response. Susan David explains that emotions and habits are deeply connected, and small changes in how we respond to emotions can lead to significant shifts in behavior. For example, instead of reacting impulsively to anger, a person might practice pausing for a few seconds before responding. That small pause creates space between emotion and action, which gradually reduces reactive behavior. Similarly, instead of avoiding discomfort completely, a person might choose to stay with a difficult emotion for a few extra moments and observe it. Over time, these small acts of awareness build emotional strength and resilience. A powerful real-life example of this concept can be seen in personal growth journeys. Many people assume that becoming disciplined, confident, or emotionally strong requires a complete transformation of personality. But in reality, most long-term success stories are built on small, consistent habits. A person improving their health does not change everything in one day. They start by drinking more water, walking a little more, or improving one meal at a time. A person improving communication skills does not suddenly become expressive. They start by asking one question in a conversation or sharing one honest thought. These small improvements accumulate and create visible change over time. Another important insight from this section is that emotional resistance decreases when change is gradual. Large changes often trigger fear, overwhelm, and avoidance, while small changes feel manageable and achievable. For example, someone trying to overcome fear of failure might avoid taking big risks, but they can begin by taking small, low-pressure steps toward action. Each successful step builds confidence, which then makes the next step easier. This gradual exposure helps the mind adapt without triggering defensive emotional reactions. Susan David emphasizes that small changes are powerful because they work with the brain's natural learning system. The brain adapts based on repetition and experience, not sudden declarations of change. When a person repeatedly chooses a small new behavior, the brain begins to treat it as normal. Over time, what once felt difficult becomes automatic. This is how emotional agility develops, not through force, but through consistent practice of small adjustments in awareness and response. A practical way to apply this concept in daily life is to identify one small emotional or behavioral change you can make today. Instead of trying to fix everything at once, focus on one area. For example, if you often react quickly in conversations, your small change should be pausing before responding. If you tend to overthink, your small change should be writing down one thought instead of letting it loop in your mind. If you struggle with motivation, your small change should be starting tasks for just 5 minutes. These small actions may seem minimal, but they build momentum over time. Another useful practice is tracking small wins. Noticing and acknowledging even minor improvements reinforces positive behavior and builds internal confidence. Over time, these small changes begin to reshape identity. Instead of thinking, "I am someone who struggles with discipline," you begin to think, "I am someone who is improving every day." This identity shift is one of the most powerful outcomes of small, consistent change. Ultimately, this section teaches that big transformations in life are not created by one massive effort, but by many small, repeated decisions that gradually reshape how you think, feel, and act. Emotional agility grows through consistency, not intensity, and every small step matters more than it appears in the moment. Main points. Big life changes are created through small, consistent actions over time. Emotional transformation happens gradually, not instantly. Real-life examples include confidence building, studying habits, communication, and health improvement. Small changes reduce emotional resistance and make growth more sustainable. The brain adapts through repetition, turning small actions into automatic behaviors. Practical action. Choose one small behavior change and practice it daily. Tracking small wins reinforces progress and builds confidence. Emotional agility develops through consistent micro-decisions. Reflective questions. What small change can I start today? Where am I waiting for big change instead of taking small action? How would my life change if I improved just 1% every day? Building Better Habits in Emotional Agility by Susan David explains that lasting change in life is not created by motivation or sudden bursts of inspiration, but by the consistent repetition of small, intentional behaviors that gradually shape how we think, feel, and respond to the world. Habits are powerful because they operate in the background of our daily life, often without conscious awareness. Over time, these repeated actions become automatic patterns that define our emotional responses, productivity, relationships, and overall mindset. The book emphasizes that if you want to change your life, you must first change your habits, because habits eventually shape identity. To understand this, imagine a person who wants to become more productive but struggles with procrastination. Every day, they delay important tasks, get distracted, and promise themselves they will start tomorrow. Over time, This behavior becomes a habit, and the brain starts to associate work with avoidance and discomfort. Now imagine the same person decides to build a small new habit. Instead of waiting for motivation, they start working for just 5 minutes when they sit down. At first, it feels insignificant, but repeated daily, this small habit slowly changes their relationship with work. The brain begins to associate starting tasks with action instead of resistance. Over time, procrastination reduces not because of pressure, but because of habit restructuring. In real life, habits influence emotional patterns more than people realize. For example, someone who constantly checks social media whenever they feel bored or anxious is not just forming a digital habit, but also reinforcing emotional avoidance. Instead of sitting with discomfort or reflecting on their feelings, they escape into distraction. Over time, this becomes a default response to stress. Similarly, a person who responds to criticism with defensiveness is not just reacting emotionally in that moment. They are repeating a habit of protecting the ego rather than processing feedback. These patterns, repeated over months or years, become deeply ingrained emotional habits that feel automatic and difficult to break. Susan David explains that building better habits requires awareness of emotional triggers. Most habits are not random. They are connected to emotional states. For example, stress might trigger overeating, loneliness might trigger excessive phone use, and fear of failure might trigger avoidance. When people become aware of the emotional triggers behind their habits, they gain the ability to interrupt the cycle. Instead of reacting automatically, they can pause and choose a different response. This is where emotional agility plays a key role, creating space between feeling and action so that habits can be changed consciously. A powerful real-life example of habit transformation can be seen in someone trying to improve their health. Instead of making extreme changes like strict dieting or intense workouts, they begin with small consistent habits such as drinking more water, walking for 10 minutes daily, or replacing one unhealthy meal. These small actions may not show immediate results, but over time they reshape identity from someone trying to be healthy to someone who lives a healthy lifestyle. The key is consistency, not intensity. Another important aspect of building better habits is replacing, not just removing, old patterns. Simply trying to stop a habit rarely works because the brain seeks replacement behavior. For instance, if someone tries to stop stress eating but does not replace it with another coping mechanism, they are likely to return to the old habit. However, if they replace it with a healthier alternative like deep breathing, journaling, or short walks, the emotional need is still addressed but in a more constructive way. This makes habit change more sustainable. Susan David emphasizes that identity is shaped by habits over time. People do not become confident, disciplined, or emotionally stable overnight. They become those things through repeated behavior. Every time someone chooses to pause instead of reacting, study instead of procrastinating, or reflect instead of avoiding, they are reinforcing a new identity. These small decisions accumulate and gradually transform how a person sees themselves. The shift is not only behavioral but also psychological. A practical way to apply this concept in daily life is to start by identifying one habit you want to change and the emotional trigger behind it. For example, if you often avoid studying because it feels overwhelming, your first step is not to study for hours, but to start with a small, manageable action like 5 focused minutes. If you tend to react emotionally in conversations, your habit change could be introducing a pause before responding. If you frequently procrastinate, your habit could be starting tasks immediately for a short duration without pressure for perfection. Another useful practice is habit stacking, where you attach a new habit to an existing routine. For example, after brushing your teeth, you might spend 2 minutes planning your day. After lunch, you might take a short walk. After feeling stressed, you might pause and take 3 deep breaths. These small additions integrate new behaviors into existing routines, making them easier to sustain. Ultimately, this section teaches that building better habits is not about willpower alone, but about understanding emotional triggers, starting small, and repeating consistently until new patterns become natural. Emotional agility grows when habits align with values and when reactions are replaced with intentional responses. Over time, these habits shape not just behavior, but identity and life direction. Main points. Habits shape long-term behavior, emotions, and identity. Most habits are linked to emotional triggers such as stress, boredom, or fear. Real-life examples include procrastination, social media use, emotional eating. And defensiveness, small, consistent habits are more effective than extreme short-term efforts. Replacing old habits is more effective than simply trying to stop them. Identity is formed through repeated behaviors over time. Practical action. Identify one habit, its emotional trigger, and replace it with a small positive action. Habit stacking helps integrate new behaviors into daily routines. Reflective questions. What emotional triggers control my habits? Which habit is shaping my identity right now? What small change can I start today that aligns with the person I want to become? Using emotional agility in career. In Emotional Agility by Susan David explains how emotional intelligence becomes truly powerful when applied in the workplace and career decisions, where pressure, uncertainty, competition, and constant evaluation often trigger strong emotional reactions. Many people assume that career success is purely based on skills, qualifications, or external opportunities. But the book highlights that emotional agility plays a critical role in how people respond to setbacks, criticism, change, and ambition. In a career context, emotional agility means being able to face uncomfortable emotions like fear, self-doubt, frustration, and disappointment without letting them derail decisions or define professional identity. To understand this, imagine an employee who works very hard on a project but receives critical feedback from their manager. A person without emotional agility may immediately feel attacked, become defensive, lose motivation, or even stop believing they are not good enough for the job. This emotional reaction can damage performance and limit future growth. However, someone practicing emotional agility experiences the same feedback, but processes it differently. They acknowledge the discomfort, separate emotion from identity, and ask what can be learned from the feedback. Instead of seeing criticism as failure, they view it as information for improvement. The situation is the same, but the emotional response determines whether it becomes a setback or a stepping stone. In real life, career challenges often trigger emotional reactions that quietly influence long-term decisions. For example, a person who is passed over for promotion might feel disappointment and immediately conclude, "I am not valued here," which leads them to disengage from their work or even quit impulsively. Another person in the same situation may also feel disappointed, but uses emotional agility to pause and reflect. Is this rejection a reflection of my entire capability, or is it an opportunity to develop specific skills? This second response creates room for growth instead of emotional shutdown. Similarly, someone facing job uncertainty might react with fear and avoid thinking about the future, while another person acknowledges the fear and begins planning alternative paths calmly. Susan David explains that one of the biggest challenges in career development is not external obstacles, but internal emotional responses. Fear of failure can prevent people from applying for opportunities. Perfectionism can stop people from sharing ideas. Imposter syndrome can make highly capable individuals underestimate their abilities. Emotional agility helps individuals recognize these internal voices without being controlled by them. Instead of thinking, "I am not good enough," a person can say, "I am noticing self-doubt, but I can still take action." This separation between emotion and action is what allows career growth even in uncertain or challenging environments. A powerful real-life example of emotional agility in career is seen when people change jobs or industries. Such transitions often trigger anxiety about stability, identity, and future success. A rigid emotional response might lead someone to stay in an unfulfilling job simply because it feels safe. However, emotional agility allows them to acknowledge the fear while still exploring opportunities that align with their values and long-term goals. They do not eliminate fear, but they prevent fear from making the decision for them. This creates more intentional and fulfilling career choices. Another important application is handling workplace feedback and criticism. Many professionals struggle not because they lack ability, but because they interpret feedback emotionally rather than constructively. For example, a manager's suggestion for improvement might be perceived as personal failure instead of professional guidance. Emotional agility allows a person to pause, observe their emotional reaction, and reframe the feedback as an opportunity to grow. This shift can significantly improve performance, relationships at work, and long-term career progression. Susan David emphasizes that careers are not linear journeys, but evolving paths filled with uncertainty, change, and learning. Emotional agility helps individuals navigate this uncertainty without becoming overwhelmed. For instance, during periods of high workload or failure, instead of thinking, "I cannot handle this," an emotionally agile mindset asks, "What is this situation asking me to learn?" This simple reframing changes the emotional experience from helplessness to curiosity, which leads to better problem solving. A practical way to apply emotional agility in career is to start noticing emotional triggers at work. Whenever you feel strong reactions like frustration, anxiety, or self-doubt, pause and identify what is really happening. Ask yourself, what emotion am I experiencing right now? What triggered this emotion? Is my reaction helping or limiting my professional growth? This reflection creates awareness that prevents impulsive decisions and supports more thoughtful responses. Another useful practice is separating identity from performance. Instead of saying, I failed at this task, so I am not capable, you can reframe it as, this task did not go as expected, but I can improve it. This shift protects self-confidence while still allowing learning. Over time, this mindset builds resilience and adaptability, both of which are essential for long-term career success. Ultimately, this section teaches that emotional agility in career is about responding to professional challenges with awareness, flexibility, and purpose instead of emotional reactivity. It transforms criticism into learning, failure into feedback, and uncertainty into opportunity. Careers become more sustainable and meaningful when emotional responses are managed effectively rather than suppressed or ignored. Main points. Emotional agility helps manage emotions effectively in career challenges and workplace pressure. Emotional reactions often influence decisions more than actual skills or circumstances. Real-life examples include criticism, promotions, job changes, and workplace feedback. Fear, self-doubt, and imposter syndrome can limit career growth if not managed. Key shift. I am not good enough. I am experiencing self-doubt, but I can still act. Feedback becomes an opportunity for growth instead of a personal. Attack. Emotional agility supports better decision-making during uncertainty and career transitions. Practical action. Identify emotional triggers at work and pause before reacting. Reflective questions. How do I usually react to criticism or setbacks at work? Where is fear influencing my career decisions? What would change if I responded to challenges instead of reacting to them emotionally? Handling stress and pressure in Emotional Agility by Susan David explains that stress is not simply an external problem caused by workload, deadlines, or life demands, but a complex interaction between external pressure and internal emotional response. While stress is often unavoidable, suffering under stress is not inevitable. The difference lies in how a person interprets, relates to, and responds to stressful situations. Emotional agility in this context means being able to notice stress without being overwhelmed by it, understand its source, and respond in a way that aligns with values rather than panic or avoidance. To understand this, imagine a student preparing for final exams. The workload is heavy, expectations are high, and time feels limited. One student reacts to this pressure by panicking, constantly thinking, I am not prepared, which leads to distraction, procrastination, and increased anxiety. The stress becomes a cycle that feeds itself. Another student in the same situation also feels pressure, but instead of resisting it or panicking, they acknowledge it. I am feeling stressed because this exam is important to me. This simple recognition changes everything. Instead of being consumed by stress, they begin to structure their study time, take short breaks, and focus on one task at a time. The external situation is identical, but the internal response creates a completely different outcome. In real life, stress and pressure often appear in situations where performance and expectations collide. For example, a working professional facing a tight deadline may feel overwhelmed by multiple tasks. Without emotional agility, they might spiral into thoughts like, I cannot handle this, which increases stress and reduces productivity. However, with emotional agility, they pause and break the situation into manageable parts, recognizing that stress is signaling importance, not incapability. This allows them to prioritize tasks instead of becoming paralyzed by pressure. Similarly, an athlete before a big competition might feel intense pressure to perform well. If they interpret this pressure as fear of failure, it may affect performance. But if they interpret it as energy and readiness, it can be channeled into focus and action. Susan David explains that stress is often intensified by resistance. When people try to fight stress or deny it, they create internal tension. For example, someone who tells themselves, I should not feel stress, is actually adding another layer of pressure on top of existing stress. This creates a double burden, the original stressor and the emotional resistance to stress itself. Emotional agility teaches that the goal is not to eliminate stress, but to change one's relationship with it. Instead of viewing stress as a threat, it can be seen as information that something matters and requires attention. A powerful insight from this section is that stress often signals alignment or misalignment with values. For instance, a person may feel stressed in a job not because they are incapable, but because the work does not align with their deeper values such as creativity, autonomy, or purpose. In contrast, stress in a meaningful task may feel challenging but also motivating because it is connected to something important. Understanding this difference helps individuals respond more intelligently to pressure rather than reacting emotionally. Another real-life example can be seen in family or personal responsibilities. A parent managing multiple responsibilities may feel overwhelmed and believe they are failing at everything. If they become fused with this thought, stress increases and clarity decreases. But if they step back and observe the situation, they might realize that stress is coming from trying to do everything perfectly at once. By acknowledging this, they can prioritize what truly matters and let go of unnecessary pressure. Emotional agility here transforms chaos into clarity. Susan David emphasizes that handling stress effectively requires pausing before reacting. In moments of pressure, the brain often moves into survival mode, pushing people toward impulsive decisions or avoidance. Emotional agility introduces a small but powerful gap between stimulus and response. In that gap, a person can ask, "What am I feeling right now? What is this stress trying to tell me? What is one small action I can take right now instead of reacting to everything at once?" These questions shift focus from overwhelm to action. A practical application of this concept is breaking stressful situations into smaller, manageable steps. Instead of thinking, "I have too much to do," you can reframe it as, "What is the next small step I can take?" This reduces emotional overload and creates momentum. Another useful practice is normalizing stress instead of fearing it. Recognizing that stress is a natural response to important situations helps reduce self-judgment and emotional resistance. Ultimately, this section teaches that stress itself is not the enemy. The real challenge lies in how we respond to it. When people react impulsively or resist stress, it grows stronger. But when they observe it, accept it, and respond intentionally, stress becomes manageable and even useful. Emotional agility transforms pressure from something that overwhelms into something that guides action and clarity. Main points. Stress is shaped by both external pressure and internal emotional response. Emotional agility helps manage stress without being overwhelmed by it. Real-life examples include exams, work deadlines, sport performance, and family responsibilities. Resistance to stress often increases suffering instead of reducing it. Stress can signal what matters or what needs attention. Practical action. Pause, break tasks into small steps, and focus on one action at a time. Reframing stress as information improves clarity. And decision-making. Emotional agility creates space between pressure and response. Reflective questions. What is my stress trying to tell me right now? Where am I resisting stress instead of understanding it? What is the smallest action I can take to reduce overwhelm in this moment? Teaching Emotional Intelligence and Emotional Agility by Susan David explains that emotional intelligence is not something people are simply born with, but a set of learnable skills that can be developed through awareness, practice, and modeling in everyday life. At its core, teaching emotional intelligence means helping people, whether children, students, employees, or even oneself, understand, recognize, and respond to emotions in a healthy and constructive way rather than suppressing, avoiding, or being controlled by them. It is about building the ability to name emotions accurately, understand their purpose, and choose responses that align with values instead of impulsive reactions. To understand this, imagine a child who becomes angry after losing a game. One response from an adult might be to dismiss the emotion by saying, "Don't be upset," or "It's not a big deal," which teaches a child to ignore or suppress feelings. Another approach, aligned with emotional intelligence, is to acknowledge the emotion by saying, "I can see you are frustrated because you wanted to win." This simple validation helps the child understand what they are feeling and why. Over time, they learn that emotions are not something to hide or fear, but something to recognize and manage. This foundational learning shapes how they respond to challenges throughout life. In real life, emotional intelligence becomes especially important in environments like schools, workplaces, and families. For example, a teacher who notices a student struggling with frustration in class might choose to respond with patience rather than punishment. Instead of labeling the student as lazy or inattentive, the teacher recognizes that frustration might be blocking learning. By helping the student name and understand the emotion, the teacher is effectively teaching emotional regulation. Similarly, in workplaces, a manager who acknowledges employee stress instead of ignoring it creates an environment where people feel safe to express concerns and seek solutions rather than silently burning out. Susan David explains that teaching emotional intelligence is not about eliminating difficult emotions, but about normalizing them. Many people grow up believing that emotions like sadness, anger, or fear are weaknesses. As a result, they learn to hide or suppress them, which often leads to emotional imbalance later in life. Emotional intelligence teaches that all emotions have value and purpose. For example, anger can signal injustice, fear can signal risk, and sadness can signal loss or unmet needs. When these emotions are understood instead of suppressed, they become useful information rather than overwhelming forces. A powerful real-life example of emotional intelligence in action can be seen in how families handle conflict. In some households, disagreement leads to shouting, blame, or silence. In others, emotional intelligence is practiced through calm communication. For instance, instead of saying, "You never listen to me," a person might say, "I feel unheard when I'm interrupted." This shift from blame to emotional awareness changes the entire dynamic of communication. It teaches others not only what the problem is, but also what emotion is underneath it. Over time, this creates healthy relationships where emotions are expressed clearly rather than explosively. Another important aspect of teaching emotional intelligence is modeling behavior rather than just instructing it. People learn emotional responses more from observation than from explanation. For example, if a parent tells a child to stay calm but reacts angrily to stress themselves, the child learns inconsistency. However, if the parent demonstrates calm breathing, thoughtful responses, and emotional labeling during stressful situations, the child naturally learns to do the same. The same applies in workplaces, where leaders who handle pressure with emotional awareness set the tone for the entire team. Susan David emphasizes that emotional intelligence also involves creating safe spaces for emotional expression. This means allowing people to express feelings without fear of judgment or punishment. In such environments, individuals are more likely to communicate openly rather than suppress emotions until they become overwhelming. For instance, an employee who feels comfortable discussing workload stress early is less likely to experience burnout later. Similarly, a student who feels safe expressing confusion is more likely to learn effectively than one who fears being judged for not understanding. A practical way to apply this concept in daily life is to start by practicing emotional labeling in conversations. Instead of reacting immediately or dismissing emotions, you can acknowledge them by saying things like, "It sounds like you're feeling frustrated," or "I can see the situation is making you anxious." This helps others feel understood and also teaches emotional awareness. Another practice is self-modeling, where you consciously observe and name your own emotions in real time, such as, "I notice I'm feeling overwhelmed right now, so I will take a moment before responding." Another useful application is replacing judgment with curiosity. Instead of labeling emotions as good or bad, you can ask what the emotion is trying to communicate. For example, if someone feels jealousy, instead of suppressing it or feeling guilty, they can explore what it reveals about their desires or insecurities. This approach turns emotional experiences into opportunities for understanding rather than sources of shame. Ultimately, this section teaches that emotional intelligence is not just a personal skill, but a transferable life skill that shapes how individuals interact with others and themselves. Teaching emotional intelligence means creating environments where emotions are understood, accepted, and used as tools for growth rather than suppression or conflict. When practiced consistently, it leads to healthier relationships, better communication, and more emotionally aware individuals. Main points. Emotional intelligence is a learnable skill, not an innate trait. It involves recognizing, understanding, and responding to emotions effectively. Real-life examples include parenting, teaching, workplace leadership, and family communication. Validating emotions helps people understand and regulate them better. Emotions are signals that provide useful information rather than problems. To eliminate modeling emotional behavior is more powerful than verbal instruction. Safe emotional environments encourage open communication and reduce burnout. Practical action. Practice emotional labeling in yourself and others. Replace judgment with curiosity when dealing with emotions. Reflective questions. How do I respond to others' emotions in daily life? Am I modeling emotional intelligence in my behavior? Where can I create a more emotionally safe environment for myself and others? Helping Others Grow in Emotional Agility by Susan David explains that true support for others is not about fixing their problems, giving quick advice, or trying to eliminate their difficult emotions, but about creating the emotional space where they can understand themselves, process their experiences, and develop their own resilience. Many people believe helping means immediately solving someone's struggle, but the book emphasizes that real growth happens when individuals are guided to face their emotions, reflect on their experiences, and discover their own capacity to respond with clarity and strength. To understand this, imagine a friend who has just failed an important exam. A common reaction might be to immediately say, "Don't worry, it's not a big deal," or "You will pass next time," with the intention of making them feel better. While this may seem comforting, it often unintentionally dismisses their emotions. The person may still feel disappointed, but now also feels unheard. A more emotionally agile response would be to acknowledge their experience by saying something like, "I can see this really matters to you, and it must feel disappointing." This simple shift validates the emotion instead of minimizing it. Once a person feels understood, they are more open to reflecting on what happened and how to move forward. In real life, helping others grow often appears in family relationships. For example, when a child is upset after losing a game or making a mistake, many parents instinctively try to fix the situation or distract the child from the emotion. However, emotional growth happens when the child is guided to sit with the feeling, understand it, and learn from it. A parent might say, "It looks like you are frustrated because you really wanted to win. What do you think you can do differently next time?" This approach does not remove the discomfort, but it helps the child build emotional awareness and problem-solving skills. Over time, the child learns that emotions are not something to avoid, but something to understand and work through. Susan David explains that helping others grow requires resisting the urge to control their emotional experience. When people are struggling, the natural instinct is often to reduce their discomfort as quickly as possible. However, this can prevent emotional development. For instance, in workplaces, a manager might want to immediately solve an employee's stress by reducing their workload or avoiding difficult conversations. While sometimes necessary, this approach can also prevent employees from developing coping skills. A more growth-oriented approach is to ask questions like, "What part of this challenge feels most difficult?" or "What support do you need to move forward?" This encourages reflection and builds autonomy rather than dependency. Another important aspect of helping others grow is learning to listen without immediately offering solutions. Many conversations become one-sided advice-giving sessions, where the listener focuses on fixing rather than understanding. Emotional agility teaches that listening itself is a powerful form of support. For example, when someone shares feelings of anxiety about their future, instead of immediately offering plans or reassurance, simply listening and reflecting back what they are feeling can be far more impactful. Saying, "It sounds like you are feeling uncertain about what comes next," helps the person clarify their own emotions and often leads them to insight without external pressure. Susan David emphasizes that growth happens when individuals are allowed to experience discomfort in a supported environment. Emotional discomfort is not something to eliminate, but something to work through. For example, a person struggling with failure may initially want to avoid thinking about it, but when someone helps them explore the experience rather than escape it, they begin to extract meaning from it. They may realize what went wrong, what they can improve, and how they can approach similar situations differently in the future. Without this process, emotional growth is limited because avoidance prevents learning. A real-life example of this concept can be seen in friendships and relationships. When someone is going through a breakup, the instinct might be to distract them with entertainment or constant reassurance that someone better will come. While comforting in the short term, this can delay emotional processing. A more helpful approach is to allow space for them to express sadness, anger, or confusion without rushing them out of it. By being present and non-judgmental, you help them process the experience fully, which leads to healthier emotional recovery. Another key insight is that helping others grow also involves helping them connect with their own values. Instead of giving direct instructions on what they should do, emotionally agile support encourages reflection. For example, instead of saying you should quit your job, a more empowering approach will be, "What matters most to you in your work right now?" This helps the person reconnect with their core values and make decisions that align with their authentic self rather than external pressure. Susan David highlights that emotional growth is not linear, and people often move through cycles of confusion, clarity, setback, and progress. Helping others grow means being patient with this process and not rushing outcomes. It also means recognizing that discomfort is not a sign of failure, but a natural part of transformation. When people are supported through emotional difficulty instead of being rescued from it, they develop stronger emotional resilience and self-awareness. A practical way to apply this concept in daily life is to practice reflective listening. Instead of immediately responding with solutions or advice when someone shares a problem, focus on understanding their emotional experience first. You can respond with phrases like, "That sounds really difficult," or "I can see why you feel that way." Another practice is asking open-ended questions that encourage reflection rather than dependency, such as, "What do you feel you need right now?" or "What would help you move forward in this situation?" Another important application is becoming comfortable with silence and emotional space. Often, people rush to feel silent because discomfort feels uneasy, but allowing space gives others time to think and process their emotions. This creates an environment where deeper insights can emerge naturally rather than being forced. Ultimately, this section teaches that helping others grow is not about fixing their emotions, but about supporting their ability to understand and navigate them. When you help someone sit with their emotions, reflect on their experiences, and reconnect with their values, you empower them to grow stronger from within. True help is not removing struggle, but helping others build a capacity to move through it with awareness and resilience. Main points. Helping others grow means supporting emotional understanding. Not fixing problems. Emotional validation is more powerful than quick reassurance or advice. Real-life examples include friendships, parenting, workplace leadership, and relationships. Growth happens when people are allowed to process emotions rather than avoid them. Listening without immediately offering solutions builds emotional awareness. Asking reflective questions encourages autonomy and self-discovery. Emotional discomfort is part of growth, not something to eliminate. Practical action. Practice reflective listening and ask open-ended questions. Allow silence and emotional space for deeper reflection. Reflective questions. Am I trying to fix or truly understand others? How do I respond when someone is emotionally struggling? Do I create space for others to process their emotions or rush them toward solutions? Becoming Your True Self in Emotional Agility by Susan David explains that authenticity is not about being fixed in one identity or always expressing every feeling without filter, but about continuously aligning your thoughts, emotions, and actions with your deepest values, even as you grow and change over time. Many people misunderstand being your true self as simply following every emotion or staying the same no matter what. But the book clarifies that true authenticity is dynamic. It is the ongoing process of choosing how you respond to your inner experiences rather than being controlled by them, and shaping your life in a way that reflects what truly matters to you. To understand this, imagine a person who has always been told they are quiet and shy. Over time, they begin to believe this label defines who they are completely, so they avoid speaking up in meetings, hesitate to express opinions, and miss opportunity for growth. Their identity becomes a limitation rather than a truth. Now imagine another person in a similar situation who feels the same nervousness in social situations but does not let that feeling define their identity. Instead, they recognize, "I feel nervous, but I also value growth and contribution." Even while feeling discomfort, they choose to speak up when it matters. Over time, their behavior shapes a new sense of self, not based on fear or labels, but on values and intentional action. In real life, becoming your true self often requires unlearning identities that were formed from past experiences, societal expectations, or repeated emotional patterns. For example, someone who has experienced failure in the past might start identifying as not good enough, which influences their future decisions. They may avoid challenges, hesitate to try new opportunities, or underestimate their abilities. However, emotional agility allows them to separate past experiences from present identity. Instead of saying, "I am a failure," they begin to say, "I have experienced failure, but I am still capable of growth." This shift opens a door to new possibilities that were previously blocked by limiting self-beliefs. Susan David emphasizes that becoming your true self is not about discovering a hidden, unchanging version of who you are, but about actively choosing who you want to be in alignment with your values. This means your identity is not something you find once and keep forever. It is something you build through repeated choices. For instance, A person who values kindness may not always feel kind in every situation, but they can still choose kind actions. A person who values courage may still feel fear, but they can act bravely despite it. Over time, these repeated choices shape a true self that is consistent not because emotions never change, but because values remain the guiding force. A powerful real-life example of this concept can be seen in personal transformation journeys. Someone who used to struggle with anger might be seen by others as an angry person. If they accept this label, they may continue reacting in the same way, reinforcing the identity. But if they begin practicing emotional agility, they start noticing anger as an emotion rather than identity. Instead of saying, "I'm an angry person," they say, "I'm experiencing anger right now, and I can choose how to respond." This creates space for change. Over time, they may still feel anger, but they respond differently, gradually reshaping how they see themselves. Another important aspect of becoming your true self is letting go of comparison. Many people define themselves based on how they measure against others, which leads to insecurity, competition, or self-doubt. Susan David explains that authenticity cannot be built on comparison because it shifts focus away from internal values to external validation. For example, a student might feel inadequate because others seem more successful, but when they reconnect with their own values, such as learning, curiosity, or personal growth, they begin to define success in their own terms rather than through comparison. This reduces emotional pressure and strengthens identity. Emotional agility also teaches that discomfort is often part of becoming your true self. Growth requires stepping outside familiar patterns, which naturally creates uncertainty or fear. For instance, someone who values creativity might feel afraid to share their work publicly. If they avoid this discomfort, they remain stuck in an identity shaped by fear. But if they acknowledge the fear and still take action, they begin to expand their sense of self. Over time, what once felt uncomfortable becomes part of who they are. Susan David highlights that becoming your true self involves continuous reflection and adjustment. Life changes, circumstances change, and people evolve. Staying authentic means regularly checking whether your actions still align with your values. For example, someone may choose a career path early in life that aligns with their values, but later realize those values have evolved. Emotional agility allows them to adjust their path without feeling like they are losing their identity. Instead, they recognize that growth is part of authenticity. A practical way to apply this concept is to regularly ask yourself whether your current actions reflect your values or your fears. For example, if you are avoiding a conversation, is it because it conflicts with your values or because of fear of discomfort? If you are staying in a situation, is it because it aligns with who you want to be or because of external expectations? This reflection helps separate true self from conditioned responses. Another useful practice is to challenge fixed labels you place on yourself. Instead of saying, "I'm always like this," you can shift to, "I notice I tend to behave this way in certain situations, but I can choose differently." This small change creates psychological flexibility and opens space for growth. Over time, it allows identity to become more fluid and aligned with conscious choice rather than unconscious habit. Ultimately, this section teaches that becoming your true self is not about discovering a perfect version of yourself, but about continuously aligning your actions with your values while allowing space for emotional experience. It is about flexibility, awareness, and intentional living. True selfhood is not fixed. It is actively created through the choices you make in response to your thoughts, emotions, and circumstances. Main points. Becoming your true self is a continuous process, not a fixed identity. True authenticity is based on values, not emotions or labels. Real-life examples include overcoming self-doubt, changing self-image, and handling fear-based identities. Comparison with others weakens authenticity and increases emotional pressure. Emotions do not define identity. Responses to emotions shape identity. Discomfort is part of growth, and self-discovery. Identity evolves through repeated value-based actions. Practical action. Question whether actions are driven by values or fear. Challenge fixed self-labels and replace them with flexible awareness. Reflective questions. Am I living according to my values or my fears? What labels have I accepted about myself that may no longer be true? How would my life change if I saw my identity as something I create, not something I am fixed with? Living a Meaningful Life in Emotional Agility by Susan David explains that meaning is not something that suddenly appears after achieving success, wealth, or external validation, but something that is created moment by moment through how we choose to respond to our thoughts, emotions, and life circumstances. A meaningful life is not defined by the absence of struggle, discomfort, or failure, but by the presence of intention, awareness, and alignment with personal values even in the middle of difficulty. The book emphasizes that meaning is built through emotional agility, the ability to accept emotions, reflect on them, and respond in ways that are consistent with what truly matters, rather than being driven by fear, avoidance, or impulse. To understand this, imagine two people facing similar life challenges. The first person experiences setbacks at work, relationship tension, and daily stress. They begin to feel that life is unfair and lose motivation, gradually disconnecting from their goals and values. Every difficulty feels like proof that life lacks meaning. The second person experiences similar challenges but approaches them differently. They acknowledge the pain and frustration, but instead of interpreting these experiences as meaningless, they ask what these moments are teaching them about themselves and their priorities. Even in hardship, they find opportunities to grow, learn, and reconnect with what matters most. The external circumstances are similar, but the internal approach completely changes the sense of meaning. In real life, living a meaningful life often shows up in small, everyday decisions rather than grand achievements. For example, a person working in a routine job might feel that their work is unimportant or repetitive. However, if they shift their perspective and connect their actions to a deeper purpose, such as supporting their family, contributing value, or building skills for future growth, the same job begins to feel more meaningful. Similarly, a student studying under pressure might initially feel overwhelmed and disconnected, but when they connect their learning to personal growth or future aspirations, the experience becomes more purposeful rather than purely stressful. Susan David explains that meaning is closely tied to emotional awareness and values-based action. People often assume that meaning comes from constantly feeling happy or fulfilled, but emotional agility teaches that all emotions, including sadness, fear, frustration, and uncertainty, are part of a meaningful life. These emotions are not obstacles to meaning. They are signals that help individuals understand what matters most. For example, sadness might point to something valuable that has been lost, while frustration might highlight areas where change is needed. When people learn to interpret emotions in this way, they stop seeing them as problems and start seeing them as guides. A powerful real-life example of living a meaningful life can be seen in how people respond to failure. One person might experience failure and interpret it as a sign that they are not capable, leading them to give up. Another person might experience the same failure but reflect on it differently. They might ask what went wrong, what can be improved, and how this experience fits into their larger goals. Over time, this reflective approach transforms failure into part of a meaningful journey rather than a final judgment. The meaning does not come from avoiding failure, but from engaging with it constructively. Another important aspect of living a meaningful life is recognizing that meaning is not always loud or dramatic. It often exists in quiet, consistent actions such as showing kindness, being present in conversations, completing responsibilities with care, or supporting others during difficult times. For example, a parent may not always feel that their daily tasks are significant, but through emotional agility, they can recognize that their actions are deeply meaningful because they are aligned with love, care, and responsibility. Similarly, a friend offering support during someone's difficult moment is participating in meaningful living even if the action seems small. Susan David emphasizes that a meaningful life is created through alignment between values and behavior. When people act in ways that reflect what they truly care about, even in the presence of difficult emotions, they experience a deeper sense of fulfillment. For instance, someone who values honesty may feel uncomfortable during a difficult conversation, but choosing to communicate truthfully despite that discomfort creates meaning. Another person who values growth may feel fear before taking on a challenge, but choosing to proceed anyway turns that fear into part of a meaningful experience. Emotional agility also teaches that meaning is not fixed or permanent. It evolves as people grow and change. What feels meaningful at one stage of life may shift at another stage, and this is a natural part of human development. For example, a person may initially find meaning in academic success, later in career achievement, and eventually in relationships or contribution to others. Instead of resisting this change, emotional agility encourages individuals to stay connected to their evolving values and adjust their actions accordingly. A practical way to apply this concept is to regularly reflect on whether your daily actions align with what matters most to you. For example, at the end of the day, You can ask yourself, did I act in ways that reflect my values today? Where did I act out of fear or pressure instead of intention? Another practice is to reframe difficult situations by asking what they are teaching you about your priorities and values rather than focusing only on discomfort or frustration. Another useful approach is to find meaning in small actions by connecting them to larger intentions. Even simple tasks can become meaningful when linked to values such as growth, responsibility, kindness, or contribution. For instance, completing a difficult task at work can be seen not just as obligation, but as an act of commitment to personal development. Helping someone in need can be seen not just as a momentary gesture, but as an expression of compassion and human connection. Ultimately, this section teaches that living a meaningful life is not about avoiding difficulty or constantly feeling positive, but about choosing responses that align with values even in the presence of emotional complexity. Meaning is created through awareness, reflection, and intentional action. It is built in everyday moments, shaped by how we engage with both joy and struggle, and strengthened each time we choose purpose over avoidance. Main points. Meaning is created through values-based actions, not external success or constant happiness. Difficult emotions are part of a meaningful life and provide important information. Real-life examples include work, study, relationships, and responses to failure. Meaning often comes from small, everyday actions aligned with values. Emotional agility helps transform challenges into opportunities for growth. Meaning evolves over time as values and life circumstances change. Practical action. Reflect daily on whether actions align with your values. Reframe difficulties as opportunities for learning and clarity. Connect small actions to larger intentions to create meaning. Reflective questions. Am I living according to my values or reacting to pressure? What does my current struggle reveal about what matters most to me? How can I bring more intention and meaning into my everyday actions starting today? As we reach the end of this journey through emotional agility, remember the core message. Your thoughts are not facts, your emotions are not enemies, and your true power lies in how you respond to them. When you learn to observe your emotions clearly, detach from limiting thoughts, act according to your values, and take small, consistent steps, you begin to build a life that is not controlled by pressure or fear, but guided by purpose, awareness, and meaning. If you found value in this audiobook summary, make sure to like the video, share it with someone who needs emotional clarity in their life, and subscribe to Visual Books for more powerful book summaries that can transform the way you think and live.